So let's now discuss the music that Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart wrote during his earlier life and during those final years. He was a very versatile composer. He could literally write in any form of the classical era. At an early age, he had already written masterpieces in the popular large forms, symphonies, sonatas, concertos, string quartets. He had written many of these works, and they were well loved. Unfortunately, they didn't get published until later in his life when he moved to Vienna. That's when they gained popularity. That's when he had finally broken free enough to make sure his music was really well known, and because of that, that's when his music became popular. It also was popular because his music was elegant and graceful. The melodies he used were light and happy and crisp. They were also very easy to sing, so people would hum them along just like you would hum a popular music tune today. But again, as I said before, as he aged, his music added darker elements and more complicated melodies and harmonies that led audiences to start to ignore him because they started to not understand his musical style quite as well. It wasn't until after he died then that it became more acceptable to have these complicated melodies and these other more interesting characteristics to music. That's when his music again rose to popularity and gained the stature of being written by a genius. Some of his greatest and most well-known works are his concertos, especially his piano concertos. He was a pianist, and so he would often premiere these works. He wrote concertos for himself when he was living in Vienna, and then would perform them for royalty. This was at the height of his career in Vienna, before he became more ignored. He was also a great opera composer. Yes, we're back to the operas, but these are very different operas than what you listen to in the Baroque period. No longer is opera about tragedy and Greek drama. Instead, opera has taken a turn for the better. It's now about funny stories that appeal to all audiences. Mozart himself had a great sense of drama and theater. His operas were not only fun, but exciting. He wrote 3 Italian comic operas that are considered his greatest. These are The Marriage of Figaro, Don Giovanni, and Così fan tutti, which is literally translated as All Women Behave Like This. They're funny operas, but they're also smart operas, especially Don Giovanni. We'll talk a little bit more about that one because you have listing examples from Don Giovanni. Before we do, though, I want to read this quote. "I am never happier than when I have something to compose, for that, after all, is my sole delight and passion." Mozart was famous for saying this. He wrote it in a letter to a friend, and it really became his mantra, that there was nothing better in his life than to compose beautiful music. He loved writing music, no matter what, and it's a terrible shame he died as young and in as much poverty as he did. If he'd only lived twice as long, you can imagine how much more beautiful music we would have in the world. Now back to the operas. Don Giovanni was one of his most famous operas. He wrote it in 1787. This was the period in time in which he was starting to lose favor in Vienna, his home city, the art capital of the world. This opera in particular led to his demise because it made fun of the aristocracy, and the aristocracy were the ones who were paying his bills when he lived in Vienna. It was the first opera to ever make fun of the rich patrons that first invented the form. It eventually did gain popularity, but it took a few years for people to realize that it was okay to make fun of the nobility, and that the music behind the story that Mozart had created in this opera was fantastic. He was able to combine comic and tragic elements in his story, and he was able to create a story about a nobleman that seduces one too many women and is finally brought to justice. And he really told that story amazingly through the types of music he was able to write. For the listening for Don Giovanni, I've actually provided you the entire opera. It's a wonderful video performance of the opera. It has subtitles in it. It's a blast to watch. It's about 2.5 to 3 hours long. So if you feel like watching it, treat it as a movie night, grab some popcorn, and really enjoy listening to the opera itself, but also getting involved in the story. The book has a description of the story behind the opera, as well as listening guides for the required excerpts from the opera on pages 178 to 182. Please take a look at that. I have created separate links for you for the required listening. There are two from the opera. The first is the opening scene, and the second is an aria called Leporello's Catalog Aria. These two are the examples you need to listen to because they're great examples of how classical opera sounded, as well as how recitative and aria forms were used in the classical period. Now that you've listened to the excerpts from Don Giovanni, or perhaps even the whole opera, you can listen to the Symphony No. 40 in G minor K 550. Again, this one should sound a little familiar to you because the first movement was our example for sonata form that we listened to last week. Mozart only wrote 41 symphonies. This was the second to last he ever wrote. It was written in 1788, only 3 years before his death. This was the point at which he had lost popularity, he was weak, he was poor, and he had finally lost some of his health and his youthful zeal, and he was struggling. So, you would think it would be very hard for him to be writing music, but in fact, he wrote this symphony along with the two others, 39 and 41, in just 6 weeks. No matter what, he loved composing so much that he never gave up on it and continued to write. The symphony itself is very classical in form. Every movement is a classical form, the typical forms for the era. The audiences would love this piece of music after his death because it really did epitomize classical form. Yet the melodies and harmonies are more lyrical and romantic than earlier music written by Mozart. He considered this to be a dramatic and passionate symphony, one full of emotion that spoke to how he was feeling about his life. Audiences found it a little difficult to listen to, and it never gained proper footing until he died 3 years later. It was at that point that Don Giovanni and the Symphony No. 40 and 41, for that matter, were really taken seriously and considered to be popular. For your listening for this symphony, you're required to listen to all 4 movements. The text contains a listening guide on pages 163 through 165, which should look familiar since you listened to that movement before, and on pages 182 through 185, that really describe the other 3 movements of the symphony quite well. The movements are: first movement, molto allegro; second, andante; movement 3 is a menuetto, or minuet in trio form; and movement 4 is allegro assai. So it follows the typical pattern for a classical symphony, and every movement is in a typical classical form. Please make sure to follow along with those listening guides to make sure that you really understand which movement is in which form. And then, while you're listening, simply enjoy the sound of the symphony, the beautiful melodies created. Finally, you're going to listen to the Piano Concerto No. 23 in A major K 488. This piece was written before Don Giovanni and the Symphony No. 40. It was written right at the height of his successful years in Vienna in 1786. Mozart actually wrote to many people to tell them that he loved this concerto above all of his others. He loved the key, and he loved the sound of it, and he loved the melodies. And it is still well loved by many of us today for its beauty, elegance, and clarity. It's a great example of a classical solo concerto. If you can't remember what that form is from last week, feel free to review that in the lectures from last week, or to go to your book and read about the solo concerto. The piece is scored for a typical classical orchestra and solo piano. He used paired woodwinds and a string section, and then of course the solo piano played the solo part. The one thing that was a little different is that he did not include brass in this piece. He wanted to maintain a simple and elegant sound, so he decided to not use brass since it would be too loud and brash sounding. For your listening, you're only required to listen to movement 1, allegro. I've provided a link for the full piece again in case you want to hear it all and better understand the full concerto form. Pages 185 through 187 in your text provide you with a great listening example for the first movement of this concerto. Enjoy listening, and then, once you have, move on to Ludwig van Beethoven.